Welcome back to the pod. Ben Baldwin, the computer cowboy. We're going to do our annual exercise here of ranking front offices, best and worst. And I was going to say we're going to make a handful of fan bases upset and then a handful of fan bases happy. But judging by the comments that we got last year, no one's really happy. Everyone's just upset.
Yeah, I think the teams that are going to be at the top of the list kind of already know that the nerds think highly of their teams, and then the ones at the bottom are just always angry with us.
Yeah, pretty much. I've changed around, though. I have to say, I've changed around some rankings. I've tried to digest everything that's happened. Maybe I'm a little bit too reactive to everything that's going on. So wisdom of crowds is what you get maybe by combining both of our rankings and, of course, listening to what some other smart people may be saying out there. Okay, before we get into the rankings, Mr. Baldwin, is there anything that stood out to you about this particular draft cycle other than banging your head against the wall when the Seahawks take another running back in the second round because their board must be trusted, it must be followed, it is sacrosanct to do so?
Yeah, this gets at one of the struggles with this exercise that I thought I would ask you about too is how do we separate, like when we're ranking a team in terms of the analytical front rankings, how do we separate the owner and the GM and the head coach? Like, for example, a team could have a really sharp general manager, but if his head coach doesn't want to go for fourth downs or his owner tells him you have to trade up to get Will Anderson or something, then are we kind of combining that all together into the final decision of the team and saying, like, sorry, Mr. General Manager, you're probably a smart analytical guy, but you have these other decisions imposed on you, so you're getting penalized for this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say it's safer without explicit knowledge that one party is driving a bad decision who is not is not technically part of the front office. Unless we explicitly know that, I think it's safest, at least the way that I've looked at it, just to combine it all together. Because maybe you could also say, I don't think this is true. I mean, definitely not 100% true, but maybe you could also say part of the job of being a good GM, maybe a lot more of the job than most people think, is talking ownership off of a ledge, talking coaches out of becoming amateur scouts themselves and saying they really need a particular player and putting them back on their board when they're off their board, maybe talking Patrick Mahomes out of wasting a pick on a player that he likes. Although I think that's worth it. I'm willing to that was one of my takes in an earlier pod, is I'm willing to let Patrick Mahomes burn one draft pick every draft season if he wants to on a player of his choice because he's that worth it. But I think it's just safe probably to say that, and maybe we can discuss as part of the discussion what we think about that. So hopefully that doesn't ruin your rankings.
Nope, I think that's right. I thought it was just something good to talk about beforehand. And how did you feel last year about your number 2 most analytical team, the Indianapolis Colts, and Jeff Saturday's analytics tirade afterwards?
Well, yeah, I mean that was something, but I'll give them credit. I think they redeemed themselves. I actually think I might have been low key felt good about that one versus like being forward thinking a little bit versus some others. But I agree that wasn't great, and I think without even knowing 100%, I think we really do know like who was driving the bus as far as putting Jeff Saturday in there. Although Jim Irsay, I'll give him some credit. He was with me on potentially drafting 2 quarterbacks in this last draft. So he could have been with me on the dying on that hill. So what I've done for this, and maybe I'll even bring it up for anyone who's watching on YouTube eventually, or also so Ben can see it right here. So there is okay, so what I've done is I've compiled here the rankings, some of it from, I say consensus. These are the NFL.com rankings that Greg Rosenthal puts together. I think he's a pretty thoughtful dude. He's a good analyst. So he's probably not actually consensus. He's probably a little bit less reactive than some others. But these are the rankings that he had. And then he had a number of rankings at the end for teams where he says they were too new to even judge. The Vikings, the Titans, the Steelers, the Cardinals, the Bears, the Giants, and the Raiders. I would kind of disagree. I think anyone who's been through 2 cycles, I'm okay at judging right here.
Yep.
But maybe the Cardinals and the Titans, it's a little bit, and the Steelers, I guess, is a little bit early to figure those out. And then I've also have our rankings from last year on here where we didn't rank them, 1 through whatever. We said I had the top 5 best and the top 5 worst. You had the top 5 best, the bottom 3 worst, and then you also agree with me the 49ers were overrated. So maybe quickly we'll just take a lay of the land of what we had last year before we get into the best and the worst this year. So last year we both had the Ravens as being the best. And then other ones, you had the Bills, then the Browns, then the Eagles, then the Rams. I had the second best being the Colts, which we'll discuss here. Then we also the Browns at 3rd, the Eagles also at 4th. We were in alignment a lot on this side of the equation. And then the Chargers, because I kind of ran out of options, honestly, for who I like there. And I put the Chargers then as being the 5th best. Okay, so that's kind of like the lay of the land for what we're going to talk about here. I'll let you start here, and we'll start at number 5. And then if you reveal anyone who's also on my list, I'll talk about it. If it's not on my list, I won't talk about it. And then we'll just move down to number 1, because mine have shifted around a bit. I think there's been some additions. There's been some shifts here. Again, I may be too reactive here. But part of it, I think, and you'll probably be part of this too, is to think not only the actions that they've taken, but maybe their general inclination / hiring practices when it comes to having analytical thinkers in the front office.
Yeah, so I had the Rams at 5 last year, and I looked for a team to move ahead of them, and I couldn't do it. Maybe you'll successfully sell me on the Colts, but they had a horrible season this past year on the field in terms of injuries and stuff. And part of the reason I put them at 5 was because they really invest in this sports science stuff and never got injured. And I thought that was a point in their favor. Obviously that looked horrible during the past year, but in terms of big picture, they invest in high value positions. They went out and got a quarterback when their head coach thought it wasn't workable with the last quarterback. And perhaps that hasn't aged great either, comparing how Goff and Stafford played in this past season. But in terms of teams that I mostly trust to not do anything catastrophically bad, I think they're still up there. And this isn't as much a vote of confidence in the Rams' favor as much as looking around the league and trying to find another team that could replace them.
Okay, so I do, again, this season, I do not have, or this year, I do not have the Rams in my top 5. I don't know. I guess for me, I wasn't as sold on the sports science stuff just because it's really opaque to figure out. And obviously it's all results based, but if it's consistently good, you could probably get something out of that. We know they have people working on it. So that's part of it. What I will also say though, for them is how do we think about the Rams if that Stafford interception against the 49ers was caught rather than dropped, and they get eliminated. They don't have the Super Bowl. I know there's a lot of thinking you could say, well, they did all these things. They went all in. Everything else they did. They got their Super Bowl. So when everything crumbles to hell the last couple of seasons, it's okay. But I don't know. I guess I just have trouble figuring out, other than, like you said, Stafford probably kind of wanted to go to the Rams too. So there's some luck there. The Aaron Donald extension was just an abomination. They just threw money at him because he said he was going to retire, I guess. Some other things. And I don't know. I think they've been good in the draft, dealing with the fact that they have no draft picks. But this season, we really saw them. They had 10 picks in the 5th, 6th, and 7th round this year because they traded back so many times and accumulated so many of those picks. I don't know. Like, I'm all about trading back. I'm all about taking shots, but even I don't know how that's going to work out and figuring out their whole cap situation now that they have Stafford on a bigger deal. So I don't know. I think there's just enough there where I'm skeptical, at least, that they're going to be able to turn this around because the offensive line is probably also going to be really bad again this year. And you'll have we'll enjoy your Stafford versus offensive line rankings with Jared Goff there. And I don't know. I'm not confident that he's going to necessarily have a great year this year with probably a bottom 5 offensive line.
Yeah, I think that's all fair. They are a very hard team to pigeonhole, I guess, just because they operate so differently than everybody else with never having early picks. And that came back to burn them this year when they sent a very high pick to the Lions. And I'll be interested to see how they approach this year. I think it would be reasonable to take all these young guys that they drafted and give them a lot of playing time and expect to be bad this year and then maybe take their shot on a quarterback next year. I think that's what I would do. And we'll see if that's actually the path that they take.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Like I said, I guess it was the Vikings a few years ago who had a bunch of 7th round picks. I'm not sure much ever came from that. At least it was 5th round too, but it was interesting how they had a very different strategy though than the 49ers, which spoiler alert, I'll discuss them as part of my strategy of having so few picks, but what you're going to do with them, where the 49ers like traded up somewhat, didn't trade back. Whereas the Rams were trying to, make, chicken salad out of chicken shit in a way. And they were doing the reverse there for the 49ers. Okay. So my team that I'm ranking as 5th best this year. And again, I'm just going to put the Chargers there because I don't think they've done anything that bad. I think they were a team that was taking some calculated risks going last year when it came to Khalil Mack, which didn't work out. Some other free agent signings like JC Jackson that didn't work out. Were those bad plays? I don't know. I think there was an element of having free agents that you can sign that maybe only have a shelf life of a year or two while you have Herbert on this rookie contract, that maybe it was worth it. Now, the results didn't come through. They didn't make any trades in the draft. They're not really a trading team in the draft, but I guess I just haven't seen them do necessarily anything that's that bad. Not jumping to negotiate some sort of deal with Austin Eckler is probably going to be a good move in the long term. And bringing in another wide receiver, which I think gives them some flexibility to maybe even move on from, Mike Williams and Keenan Allen or whoever next year, because I'm not a huge fan of Williams in that contract. I don't know. There's just not a lot that I can really pick at. I mean, they drafted a guard last year in the 1st round, so that's not great. But still, they were building up that offensive line. I just think they have the potential, and they've set the baseline at least to be a pretty good team if things come together. And last year was in the lower range of outcomes, I feel like, for their team, although in a stacked AFC. So I'm going to keep them at 5th in my rankings.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And just like with the Rams in this range, there's not a team that you can say they are clearly a top 5 and we're not going to be able to nitpick at any of their decisions. If I were a Chargers fan, the thing I would be most optimistic about would be seeing what Kellen Moore can do with this offense, and maybe that will totally change the look and efficiency of their offense this year. So that's one thing I would be excited about for them.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It's interesting. I feel like the dynamic of flipping out Lombardi for Kellen Moore, because these are two guys that are kind of both, at least in the last year, were just kind of hated by people who are Justin Herbert and Dak stans. And I feel like there's a lot of overlap in that for different people. So then, like if the quarterback you like is underperforming, then you just hate the offensive coordinator. So, I agree. I think it'll be interesting to see what he can do. Although I'm not certain that the short maybe lower risk passing game is 100% Lombardi as opposed to being something that maybe Herbert actually likes to do also, is just get the ball out of his hands quickly. So we'll see there. They still have Eckler, so I'm sure they'll be feeding him the ball there. Okay, I go to you. Are we just going to hopefully we won't just give the same exact teams that we gave in the same exact order last year, but who is your fourth best front office, Mr. Baldwin?
Yeah, so I don't have the same order as last year. So last year, fourth, we both had the Eagles. I have promoted them, which we'll talk about later. But
right, big Eagles,
yeah.
big Eagles. You've been influenced. They've gotten to you, big Eagles, and moving them up the rankings. Okay.
And teams 2 through 4 are really hard to separate for me, but I kept the Browns here, and this is probably unfairly low in them. And like the Rams, they haven't had early picks for us to see how they would use them. So we're kind of operating off limited information. And there's also the huge question of Deshaun Watson and the trade for him. And was this a good idea in both the on-field and especially off-field sense? So for all those reasons, I'm keeping them at 4. I think they've done a good job of using the resources that they have available to them. Their trades with draft picks have tended to be good. They built an offensive system where Jacoby Brissett could come in and do well with the good offensive line. They got Amari Cooper for very cheap. And I think they're setting aside the Deshaun Watson thing again. They're a team that I would trust to not make any catastrophically bad decisions. So it's kind of by default, I have placed them here.
Okay, yeah, big, the Eagles industrial complex, the Howie Roseman industrial complex, also has gotten to me. They have also gotten to me, and I do not have them at 4th anymore. And we are in alignment here because I have the Browns moving from 3rd down to 4th. I guess okay. The Deshaun Watson thing was also part of our decision making last year.
Yep.
When we had them 3rd. So, that's part of everything. So I didn't want to like double hit them necessarily and move them down further based upon that. They haven't done anything draft wise that I've really been that upset about. Free agent wise, I think it's been fine. They've taken some big swings sometimes on, like, in the past, an Austin Hooper type of candidate, which maybe wasn't the best, but they've also made some good trades, getting Amari Cooper, getting Elijah Moore, which I think is an interesting, like, for a pick swap. They're doing this pick swap thing. They're doing it with Zadarius Smith now, where at least for Elijah Moore, I think it's interesting in that if they don't have high value draft picks to get wide receivers, they don't have a ton of cap space going forward to get wide receivers. Maybe this is like a good way to get cheap potential talent, is by like grabbing someone like an Elijah Moore, where they're basically giving him away to make room for, Randall Cobb over with the Jets, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. And I don't know with the Watson deal, like, I don't think if you can set aside, the egregious nature of his crimes, I'll just say, in his actions, which I think are it's pretty hard to deny that something didn't happen there. He probably was one of the quarterbacks for how he performed through the 2020 season, who was really worth that type of mortgaging the future, trade everything, give him the highest paid contract, maybe guarantees. I'm not going to get into that necessarily. But when we're talking about free agency, essential free agency there, like, I don't think it was an overpay for Watson. I know he wasn't good last year, but I think that he will more likely bounce back than not when we're talking about Deshaun Watson purely on the field. Now, maybe part of the overpay is that if something else happens with him and he gets suspended again, then that's, that just blows up your entire franchise. So, and you combine that with the fact that I do think they have good people working there. They have probably the most sophisticated and skilled group of analysts there to work with tracking data and other things that's been in place for a long time. I'm fine putting them there, but yeah, I think 4th is good enough. Basically, you don't necessarily have to put them higher.
Okay. In agreement there.
Okay, let's go. Why don't you give me 3rd?
Okay, so I have a tie at second place because I was staring at these two teams and I was like, these are basically the exact same team. So you can tell me if you can guess who the teams are. So they don't do anything like horrifically stupid, but um, they're pretty good on fourth downs. They're generally pretty well run, but seem to not um, fully buy in on positional value when it comes to making draft picks, and they probably underinvested at wide receiver, given that they have a franchise quarterback to build around. Can you guess who the two teams are?
Well, I mean, underinvested wide receiver. So I guess the Ravens
Yep.
and underinvested wide receiver. Who else is on this? Who was on your list last year?
So
Let me look.
so the Bills are the other team. So
Oh, the Bills. Yeah, I mean, Stephon Diggs is quite an investment there, but yeah, okay. I mean, well, at least contract wise, but okay, I'll give that to you. I do like the framing though. Like, haven't done anything horrifically awful. You know, it's like hang the banner. That's like the hang the banner there for us when it comes to a good front office.
Yeah, there's such a limited amount of things that we observe about teams that I think I've come around more to saying, like, how many decisions have teams made that are like disqualifyingly horrible, and the teams at the top are the teams that have generally avoided these decisions, and for the teams at the bottom, we'll get to that soon. But yeah, I can't remember which order. Oh, I guess we both had the Ravens first last year, right? So this is a small
Yes.
demotion because the big Eagles industrial complex has gotten to
It's
both of
gotten
us.
to you more than me. Spoiler
Yeah.
alert. It's gotten to you a little bit more than me, but go
And
ahead.
with the Ravens, I think I was probably too high on them last year. And especially when it comes to their draft picks, like they've spent a lot of very high picks on what are not premium positions. And I think that's what differentiates looking ahead, what differentiates the Eagles from the Ravens. So, of course, there was the 2020 draft when their first two draft picks were a off-ball linebacker and a running back. And then last year they had two first-round picks. They drafted a safety and a center. And then this year they drafted a wide receiver first, and that was their only pick in the first two rounds because they had traded another their second round pick to give a lot of money to an off-ball linebacker who's probably really good, but it's hard to imagine that trade is going to work out for them. So with all those combined, that is how the Ravens have lost their position at number one for me.
Okay, I can dig that. Well, I'll talk about the Ravens more in a second. See, I don't have the Bills in my top 5, so I don't think I did. I think this was a disagreement that we had also last year, where you had the Bills second, I believe, and I did not have them in my top 5. And for me, when it comes to the Bills, they have a little bit, and especially they had this last season, a little bit of all-in-ism to what they're doing. And now this year, where they could have taken some of their medicine when it came to enormous jumps in contract value for Josh Allen, Stephon Diggs, Von Miller. They didn't do it. I mean, they restructured Allen, so he goes down. Diggs contract hit goes up, but it's going to go up even more. Miller, again, is kind of like a down thing. And maybe it's not going to matter. Like, maybe it's not going to matter eventually, but it's like every year I feel like you're looking at this massive cap increase next year. I mean, if you look at Allen, his cap hit's going to be 50 million next year. Diggs is going to be 28 million. Miller's going to be 24 million. Where they were in the same situation last year, and they had this whole thing where Brandon Beane at the end of the season, you know, he was getting dunked on a little bit for the fact that he was contrasting the Bills to the Bengals, saying, hey, it's a lot harder to, you know, build a team when you don't have your star receiver and quarterback on rookie deals. The thing was, last year, the Bills didn't have big cap hits on these guys. You know, they had very small cap hits. They were still part of the window at the first couple of years of contracts where they had small cap hits. Now they're going to have to start to deal with a little bit this season, but they've kind of just kicked the can, which is in contrast to Kansas City last year, who also do not have my top 5, but I'll give them credit that last year I thought they did well in they allowed Mahomes' contract to go up. They didn't really restructure anything. They lost some talent because of it. And guess what? They were still like championship level team and were able to actually win the title without having to pour into this all-in thing every season. So I guess that's what concerns me about the Bills. In addition to, whatever, they spent a second round pick on a running back last year. They're not exactly immune to some of the positional value problems in my mind for what they end up doing. So I guess I just feel like when you have a quarterback like Allen, I realize you want to be all in every season. But are they compromising their ability to be successful in a year, 2 years from now by continuing to push the chips in? Whereas if they didn't do that, they would still be a top 3 or 4 team at worst in Super Bowl odds, even if they were taking some of their medicine this season.
Yep, I think that's another fair criticism of them.
And again, it's like I can't necessarily point out like again, they may not be doing egregiously bad stuff, but I don't know if I can necessarily point out anything that's that great for them. So I'll just reveal here. For me, I have the Eagles as my third best. So obviously they're your number one. So we can talk about them. Yeah, I gave them a slight promotion, but I did not move them too far. And I'll talk about some of my concerns, some of my pushback, which may get me, maybe renditioned out to some black site somewhere if I'm talking bad about the Eagles. But we'll see. We'll see what happens there. But for my third and second teams, I had the Eagles there for third, and then second I have the Ravens. And a lot of the thing with the Ravens, the drop is a lot of the same stuff you talked about. Some positional value problems that are going on here. The Roquan Smith re-signing. Some of the play like in the draft last year and I know that they got Kyle Hamilton a lot later than a lot of people would have drafted him. But even looking at it back today, like he's probably gone down a lot more in value than a lot of mid-first round picks would have gone down in value. I know they kind of was a receiver run before them, so they couldn't get there. But I think Jahan Dotson and Treylon Burks were still left. Like if you could have those two guys straight up versus Kyle Hamilton, who are you taking? It's weird, like how quickly the positional value starts to bleed into these guys' perception and their values after the draft, but they're not quite appreciated during the draft. So taking a safety and a center in the first round last year, they got value on both of those guys versus consensus big board, but we're starting to see the fallacy of even doing that when other teams are passing on guys. So I do think there are issues there. I did like how they negotiated the Lamar Jackson deal. I thought they were very smart there. I think it was difficult to accomplish because of Lamar's situation and wanting the guaranteed. I thought using the non-exclusive franchise tag was fairly brilliant in that it kept the cap hit down, so it was realistic they could franchise tag him again next year, and it gave Lamar some feedback from the rest of the NFL that maybe, he's not on that sort of level. And then the Jalen Hurts deal happens and he's willing to, give me 5% more in all categories and I'll take the deal. So I thought that they played that well, and I'll give them credit there because I thought that was a very difficult negotiation. We see lots of teams who don't push back at all when it comes to the quarterback negotiation, and I think it can end up hurting them eventually.
Yep, they got roasted at the time for it too, and all these other teams that reportedly weren't interested in Lamar Jackson, and it kind of makes sense given that the Ravens could match, and eventually they extended him, and here they are with Lamar for a long time, probably.
Yeah. I thought the relationship might have been in a bit more trouble. I think it's interesting that his extension happened the day of the draft. Not that they would have drafted a quarterback, but I don't know. That's pretty, it's interesting to me because I don't think Lamar benefits if they don't draft a quarterback. I don't think Lamar benefits in any way from doing it then versus waiting to see what maybe Burrow or Herbert end up getting, other than maybe he just wanted to have it done. So I thought that they did the well there. Okay, so we know the Eagles are your number one. I'm gonna go ahead. Now you can roast me. You thought you were roasting me last year. Now you can super roast me this year when I put Chris Ballard and the Indianapolis
Wow.
Colts at number 1 in the front office rankings. Now, you did mention the Jeff Saturday thing. I didn't even think about that. That was all in the past. That's old news. Old news to me. Yeah, that was horrible. But at the same time, okay, like Ballard made the play. Maybe it was stupid to not trade up into 3, honestly, but obviously also the Texans were bringing heat to get that pick. So they would have had to give up something big to just move up 1 spot. So he held tight. He kind of stayed true to maybe what people think are his biggest fault, which is not being willing to take the bat off of the shoulder and swing and give up some value when needed to go get the quarterback. And he still got his quarterback, finally got the quarterback where I don't think there was an easy solution. I know hindsight is 2020 and Matt Ryan was done. Wentz was bad when his coach was kind of advocating for him, all those things. But, they were never in a great position necessarily to get a quarterback in those years. So he got the quarterback here. They continued to trade back. They did it multiple times in this draft, but they should continue to do. And, outside of the Jonathan Taylor pick, where in some ways, like when I look at Jonathan Taylor, I actually think he's maybe more special as a running back than even like a Bijan Robinson, because he does at least have the ability to have explosive plays. I think where I'm not sure if Robinson's quite on that same mark as someone who ran a sub 4.4 for Taylor, sub 4.4, and he had a bunch of explosive runs in college as a big guy. I guess I'm just not upset about anything that he's done and they've done there. Their odds are low. They're going to have a tough year this year, but I do think maybe there is some indication that he's back in control versus Irsay, where it looked like a couple of decisions, benching Ryan, bringing in Saturday, were really ownership stepping in there, and maybe Ballard is back there. And I guess I just don't have a lot to critique, especially now that he's redeemed himself with this quarterback pick.
If the Titans had traded up to 3 and the Colts had taken like Will Levis in the 2nd round, would they still have been number 1 for you? Yeah,
it would have been tough. Although I'm kind of a fan of Will Levis, to be honest. Yeah, no, it would have been tough. It sounds like that the Titans may have been in whatever. I don't know what intelligence these guys had. There was this, offhand recognition of the fact that Ballard knew, according to an article by Stephen Holder, who's the ESPN Colts guy, that he had intelligence that the Titans were not, were in on maybe Stroud or something like that, but weren't in on Richardson. So they were okay once that happened.
Yep.
Is that true or not? I don't know. But I agree that I'm worried about that. I think, I don't want to be too results based and say it was so brilliant to not give up anything. Because if someone would have jumped ahead of him and taken Richardson, it would have been a disaster. But I also know that I don't think it would have been like a Mitch Trubisky trade up. I don't think it would have been whatever that was, like a 3rd and a 4th or something like that. I think it could have been more to even move up 1 spot. And that would have been really, I don't know. That would have been a lot. So I guess I'm kind of glad they hadn't take it. I guess your concern with them is, I agree, the ownership angle is concerning. But I also think some mistakes they've made with picks was maybe listening to Frank Reich and with signings a little bit too much. And perhaps with, Shane Steichen in there, he won't have quite as much say, or maybe on that source, maybe those mistakes will be taken away. I don't know. I guess I can't really point to anything that they've done and been that upset about what they've done. And they've continued to do the trading back and things like that, that I'm really into.
Yeah, they've been good at trade backs. They haven't made that many big mistakes. They have used a lot of high value picks on non-premium positions, but even with like the Quentin Nelson one, that was after trading back. So they got 3 extra 2nd round picks or something. So if you're going to take a guard with the 6th pick and eventually pay him a ton of money, then at least you got some extra value out of it. And yeah, there's the Jonathan Taylor pick, and like he's been a good running back, but again, this is a running back pick with an early 2nd round pick. And then I think the other thing, I guess this is true of a lot of teams, but they haven't really invested a lot at wide receiver. They Well, actually, that's not true. They picked they haven't hit a wide receiver, which isn't really something
Yeah,
to judge them on.
Pittman's a
But
maybe.
Paris Campbell
Uh,
was a late second
Paris
round pick.
Campbell, I
Yeah.
think, was also a Frank Reich pick, at least
Okay.
according to the stories there. Which, again, I'm not going to absolve Ballard for that, but it was definitely. I didn't like the Campbell pick because I don't like these underneath sort of receiver guys. So yeah, that Campbell pick, and then they drafted Alec Pierce,
Yep.
where who knows, maybe he could work. I mean, I'm not huge on him either, but I did think when I watched Ritter highlights, I was like, this dude's open a lot. Ritter couldn't really hit him that often, but he did look kind of explosive down the field. And explosive down the field, not great for Matt Ryan
Yeah.
and that whole thing. So yeah.
Yeah. Luckily for you, and you're putting them number one here. Their biggest weakness, which is the quarterback thing, we won't ever have to think about again if Anthony Richardson hits. So it's not going to be something that people can use against them because
If he doesn't hit, they're all fired. They're all fired
Yeah,
anyway.
exactly.
So, and I did think it was interesting. I mean, I don't want to give him too much credit for Richardson. They say that he was their guy, basically, maybe after Bryce Young. It didn't really say. But I do think there was some talk after the draft, and Hermsmeyer was on the pod last week, and we talked about this article by this Randy Mueller guy who was a former front office guy, and him saying, you can't have consensus on a guy like Anthony Richardson, so therefore you can't do it as your top pick. And I think that is just like protecting against dissension if things go wrong in the future, that you have part of your front office that can point at the other part of the front office and say, I was right and you were wrong. And I don't feel like that's the way to make decisions. I feel like there's having dissension, not having consensus does not mean like bad decision, in my opinion.
Yeah, especially at the top of the draft, and especially for a quarterback, what you should be aiming for is upside. And there might be these high variance prospects, and those are the exact prospects where you might not be able to build consensus around. So I think it was a good pick, and I'm excited to see what Anthony Richardson might look like when he reaches the NFL. But expecting to have a consensus around him, especially, just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, think about like Mahomes, Herbert, and Allen. There's plenty of dissension, at least amongst consensus draft board types, of like, this will not work, right?
Yep.
So you probably couldn't build consensus around those guys as well as you could around maybe even Tua or someone like that. May have been an easier consensus sort of pick, and that's perhaps why he went before Herbert in that draft. Okay, so now we can talk Eagles. So maybe I'm just I have a tendency to just be contrarian, and I admit to that. So that's why, again, I don't even trust myself when it comes to this. I will take input and move things around, and I'm content to move the Eagles up and the Ravens up potentially over the Colts in my rankings. But let me give you a short. Actually, do you want to give me the Eagles case? Because I think it's fairly well established. Give me the Eagles case a bit, and maybe I'll have a couple of objections that we can discuss.
Sure. I think maybe some of our divergence in the Eagles and Colts is how we viewed Carson Wentz. So for me, the Colts giving up a first round pick for Wentz is a black mark against them, and probably why I still don't have them in the top 5. And it happened a long time ago, but it was just such a...
Well, I'll say for Wentz, I did think there was some possibility he could be like, there was a decent possibility he could be like a league average type of quarterback. I know he had a really bad year that year. And the contract was not that high. So I did think it wasn't the worst chance of like, I mean, if we're saying we knew Carson Wentz was going to be bad, then I agree. I guess I was not in that category because he had the bottom fell out season. He had one kind of middling season, and he had one season before that was top half probably, but not that great. And then of course he had the outlier season on the top end. So I guess I thought maybe they could get like league average-ish sort of quarterback play, potentially some upside for a first round pick and a fairly cheap contract. So yeah, I agree. I guess even with hindsight, I don't necessarily view that as egregiously bad. Plus they were able to trade out of it and recoup a lot of that value. Thank you, Commanders.
So the thing the Eagles have done best, I think, is generating a lot of extra draft picks, and especially first round picks. So they had that the trade with the Saints to when the Saints traded up for Chris Olave. I think they traded back with was that the Dolphins for in the Waddle trade, I think,
Yeah.
when they moved back. They moved back 6 spots and picked up the first round pick. And they traded one of those first round picks for A.J. Brown, obviously. And then this year they had 2 first round picks, one in the top 10, even though they went to the Super Bowl. Their biggest weakness, as I think we've discussed on Twitter, is overconfidence in prospect evaluation and enjoying these small trade ups in the draft, and especially at the top of the draft, where they did that for Andre Dillard, Devontae Smith, Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter, which is a lot of times to do that. And of those players, it's obviously too early to tell on Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis probably, and Devontae Smith has worked out for them, but I think the Andre Dillard one did not work out. And then also they spent a second round pick on Miles Sanders in 2019. So those are the points against them. In favor is they've done a really good job trading in the draft, and almost all of their top draft picks have gone on high value positions. They don't overinvest at positions like running back and other low value positions, I think. And they're the team that I probably trust the most to not do anything very bad.
Let me say why I'm a little bit not as high. Although, and even thinking back to the Hurts deal, like maybe I should just give them permanent status as number one, because they actually did my draft a quarterback when everyone hates you thing.
Oh yeah, that was another good one. Yeah,
which has kind of become my brand. So maybe for that reason alone, because it just basically hitting on that just allows you to do a bunch of stuff.
Yep.
And collect a bunch of picks. Now, I'll just say that I do think year over year, and maybe like 2 year, like a multiple year over year, I'm not getting more enthusiastic about them as everyone else is as the years are going on. I mean, I know they collected these picks and they used them on players. They didn't use them on poor positional value. So that's big. I'll give them that. At the same time, there is a little bit of what they did last year, and maybe you're continuing to do, of an all-in sort of element where, they trade for a bunch of veteran players. And I think those can be good moves, but they're trading for these veteran players. They're losing the veteran players. They lost a ton of guys in free agency this season. And, they're not recouping. I don't think they're going to recoup necessarily a lot of comp picks, because some guys are being released. Some guys have these void years. Some guys they're actually signing and bringing in here. And, they're bringing back Jason Kelce. They have Fletcher Cox, who's getting up there in age. I don't know. I feel like the core of the team might be dropping a bit. And what they're going to be able to do radically to boost the team back up after they've lost a bunch of players in free agency, where they kind of hit on a bunch of different things with that Jalen Hurts contract. And they're still going to have a good window here on this Hurts contract, the way that it's structured, to figure things out. But this Hurts contract is like the opposite of the Wentz contract when it comes to your ability to get out of it.
Yep.
I mean, maybe you could say the Wentz contract at the time, it was, the biggest dead cap that anyone had ever taken, is something like $40 million. Now that looks like chump change compared to what some teams are willing to take in dead cap. But with Jalen Hurts, I mean, this contract ends in a void year of $100 million cap hit, okay? And all of the different options, which will probably be extended even further. So in a way, I give him credit for like the Jalen Hurts pick, but that might be offset somewhat, at least, by now they're just wedded to Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts, a quarterback who has probably the best, who had, the best or second best or third best offensive line in football, who's very reliant upon running the ball, which will continue for a while. But, he runs between the tackles too. So I think he's going to take some punishment. Who has A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith and Dallas Goedert. Like, is that the guy you wed yourself to basically for the next 10 years? It's stuff like that that makes me concerned, where I think if you're looking at, peaks and valleys of how we view Roseman and the Eagles, I have a feeling that we may be in peak in perception, but we're actually starting to go down a bit on like what this team can end up being 2-3 years from now.
Yep, that's certainly possible. And at least in terms of how I view these rankings in my head, it's not really promoting the Eagles as much as demoting the other teams around them, and especially the Ravens, which
again, hang the banner. Did not do anything
Yeah.
egregiously awful.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's part of it. I really got to that point. I got very pessimistic going into the draft, and then Ballard redeemed himself a bit for what was going here. But I was getting very pessimistic, where I'm just throwing up my hands, like, who can I really be excited about? Because the Ravens, in particular, did some wonky stuff that I wasn't 100% into, moving them down there. Okay, let's get to the exciting part, the part that everyone enjoys more than anything, when we get to our bottom. So you had a bottom 3 last time. I had a 5. I've ranked 5. Do you have 5 or 3, or what was the situation?
I did 5 this time.
Okay, good.
It was easier than I thought it would be.
Yeah, we have to get mad at even more. We have to get more fan bases mad at us. Maybe I won't reveal what we had last year. I'll just talk about it as we mention these teams, if we have any changes here. Okay, so again, I'll let you start with 5th worst. And before you start, I'll say last year you did not have a 5th worst, but you agreed with my 5th worst of the 49ers as being quote unquote overrated. So I don't know if you would have put them in the bottom 5, but you did say that they were overrated. So go ahead. Who is your 5th worst this year?
So this team has been promoted a little bit. I think they were my 2nd worst last year, but now they are 5th, and this is the Seattle Seahawks. And I think it's possible that I'm being too harsh on them, because I'm from Seattle. They're the team I follow. So any poor decisions that they make are going to be especially aggravating for me. Okay, so first, why did they get promoted? I think the last couple off seasons they've done reasonably well compared to what they had done the last many seasons. So yes,
they set the bar. They set the bar very low for you.
Yes,
so
they set the bar extremely low. They had all these crazy draft picks where they reached on low value positions, or reached on like 60 pick reaches, like LJ Collier and
you
didn't
have to scroll down the consensus big board like 5 times to find their first round pick. So that's good.
Yeah. So the last 2 years they had one off the wall pick, which was their 2nd round running back, and then aside from that, they basically followed the consensus big board and drafted high value positions with their early picks. So yes, they had.
Which 2nd round running back are we talking about?
Well, it was 2 years.
2 years. Yeah, I just want to point out that's each year. Although Walker, to me, Walker seemed like less. I mean, whatever. It's all running backs, right? But it seemed like, well, it was earlier 2nd round though. I think it's less of a reach, but I don't know. Go ahead.
So those picks were not reaches. Those were the positional value issues.
Right, but I feel like Walker, well, whatever. I don't even know what the consensus big board is, but I feel like Walker was seen as being a better prospect than Charbonnet. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I think both picks were picked around where consensus was. So Walker was like 40th, and the latter was 50 something. So they were both they were both non-reaches. Walker was picked earlier because he's a better prospect for how much that matters with running backs, which is basically not at all. And
he has some explosive ability, which he displayed. He also has the ability, it seems, to gain 0 yards, which he also displayed.
He's a home run hitter.
I like home run hitting running backs. I'm kind of like, give me something, like even when we talk about Jonathan Taylor, like Taylor basically almost got them to the playoffs with Wentz, right?
Yeah.
Like at least it's possible to get that out of your running back. Yeah.
I lost my. Oh yeah.
Oh, so sorry. You were negging them, but praising them.
Maybe it's okay that they threw around these picks, because they did have 2 extra 2nd round picks from the Russell Wilson trade, and the Russell Wilson trade is, when we're looking at the Seahawks, maybe the thing that has changed in perception the most since the last time we did this, where a year ago they were getting roasted for trading away a franchise quarterback and hanging on to their head coach and general manager, and I think that for the Seahawks as an organization, that has aged extremely well. So that's something else that I don't know how much we should credit them for, because if, like the reports say, the ownership has to choose between the coach and the quarterback, then yes, obviously they made the right choice, because they got rid of Russell Wilson and got a bunch of draft picks for that. But I don't know how much credit the general manager should get for trading away a player who said he does not want to be there anymore.
Yeah. Well, quickly on the Wilson thing. Well, first of all, I'll just state that I made up a new sixth worst category, and I kind of put the Seahawks in there because I still think they're bad, but I didn't want. But I promoted them out of the bottom five. And I'll say with the Wilson trade, I probably should have given them more credit in a way for it last year, because I was not negative on the trade away. Probably you were, and a lot of people were, because in my opinion, what they got for him, I thought was probably the maximum you could get for him. Like they did a pretty good job. And the fact that he signed this egregious now looking extension before the season even started with the new team was like another feather in the trade cap sort of thing. So like, I think even at the time, it wasn't a obviously bad trade for a team that, which is weird because they went to the playoffs, which a team that I thought around Russell Wilson, they weren't necessarily like a high competing for a Super Bowl type of team.
Yeah. One of the big criticisms of the trade that I myself was making at the time was, okay, you trade away your quarterback and now you don't have a quarterback, and you might be just floundering in the wilderness for a decade or more without a quarterback, like teams like the Commanders and others have done. And unearthing Geno Smith is something that they did and should get credit for, and the extension was very good for the team. So
yes, the extension was excellent. I mean, that was like, I thought that was a potential problem, especially seeing some numbers. Shout out to Brad Spielberger when he first came out with the Geno numbers; they were very, very high. So like, I'm fine with the deal that they signed. They basically signed him to a 1-year deal. Who knows? Maybe they would have taken Richardson if he was available at 5.
Yeah, so I view them much less negatively than I did a year ago, but I still can't forget all the stuff they did between 2013 and 2020, where I don't need to go down the list, but they made a lot of mistakes. There's a reason that their roster is pretty barren, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where they've invested a lot and don't have a lot to show for it.
Yeah. I think you could say, like, you could give them credit for being more disciplined, but we don't know if that discipline is actually being disciplined or whether their ratings, their draft board just happened to align with the consensus big board, and they would have fired off a pick if it didn't, if it was way off.
That's right. And also maybe it's easier to draft like consensus when you have top 10 picks, which they hadn't had for a long time.
Right. That's probably also true. All right. So we're somewhat in line now. I'll go ahead and reveal my 5th worst, and I'm sticking with the 49ers here as being the 5th worst, which is interesting because the NFL, Greg Rosenthal's rankings, he has them as being the 5th best. So this is probably the biggest dichotomy between his rankings and my rankings, at least, is the 49ers. And I guess when it comes to the 49ers, where do we start? I would be very interested to see what this team would look like this year, last year, this year, next year, if they hadn't accumulated 6 third-round picks as part of the comp pick formula, where coaches and GMs, minority candidates, have gotten promoted out of their system to other places. Because if you add the value of those, and I don't think it's like more than a first-round pick almost that they've gotten out of all these different guys, which has really helped make up for the fact that, they lit a few first-round picks on fire with Trey Lance, where, we can't be too critical. I was never that into Lance. Like, I thought it was a little bit of a speculative pick. A lot of people liked him as a prospect. I was a, Jimmy Garoppolo stan, and I thought it was a little bit weird that they were going this far in, where it seemed like their only problem with Garoppolo was that he got injured all the time, which continued this season. So maybe that was very legitimate of them to have had that problem. And I guess I just don't really know whether it's like coaching and system is just making up for coaching, system, comp picks, and hitting on some later players is making up for all of these other issues that they have, where the Lance trade up, the Christian McCaffrey trade, which is fine, but like they could have got him cheaper probably in the offseason than they did during the middle season. It's the worst time to trade for a player. Trent Williams has been fine for them, but they signed him to a huge deal. He's an aging player. They traded, that sort of situation. I don't know. Like, I feel like things have been pieced together, but it would not surprise me if they fell off a lot this season versus where their expectations are, which is almost equivalent to the Eagles to win this year, where we're talking about coming into a season with Trey Lance, broken arm, Purdy, and Sam Darnold. Like, I don't know, something eventually, I feel like these mistakes that they're accumulating are going to break, even if they've gotten this tailwind of these comp picks.
Yeah, I think the interesting high-level question for those of us that are skeptical on the 49ers how they run their team is, if we think they've been so poorly run, they don't really have a quarterback, and yet they are still a very, very good team. So what explains the difference here? Is it all just Kyle Shanahan is that good of a coach and so much better of a coach than everybody else? Is it getting lucky on picks, like finding George Kittle in the 5th round and Deebo Samuel in the 2nd round and all these other guys? I guess Ayuk was a 1st rounder, right?
Yes.
And kind of what explains the divergence between how we view them, which has been pretty low for a long time, and how many games they've actually won on the field.
Well, you know what's weird about them? And well, I mean, their draft this year was an abomination, like awful.
Yes.
Trading up for a safety, kicker, tight end who doesn't even show that much potential. But I think what was interesting about them is before the Lance pick, they had this situation where they made one like probably relatively good move, although the pick didn't hit. The Kinlaw pick didn't hit. But trading away Buckner and getting the 1st round pick and not paying him was like a good move. But they had this weird thing where because Garoppolo was getting injured every other year, it would boost them way up the draft board. And they got like a Nick Bosa. They got an early 2nd round pick so they could get Deebo Samuel. Like, they probably don't get those players, right? If they're not picking 2nd and 36th in that draft. So that, I think that helped a lot too. It's like they were able to get they had this weird thing of having a good core team. And then quarterback play fell off the charts, but it actually helped them in a way once the quarterback play came in, because they were able to get these high value picks that they ended up making there. And I don't know, I just feel like we could see some decline around a lot of different places. And the defense has really been the most consistent and best part of what they've been doing for a number of years now. And how long can that maintain? Maybe it can keep on maintaining for a long time, but I guess I'm a little skeptical on it, because I don't think that they've let a lot of players go after that Buckner deal, where it seems like that they're making these good kind of long-term types of moves.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the offensive side of the ball does now that Jimmy G is gone, and we'll see if Brock Purdy can keep up what he did for a few games last year.
Yeah, Jimmy G. Now he'll be with the Raiders. So
they were 4th worst in my rankings for.
Yeah. So you have them on there.
Yeah,
okay, so
they
the
reasons.
4th worst. Okay, so all right. Well, that's good. Maybe I'll reveal my 4th worst. And I don't even know what to do with these guys, but they're going to be. I mean, I put the Texans as 4th worst, but I don't even know. It's weird. There was an article that came out from the ESPN. I forget the gentleman's name, who's the ESPN Texans guy, and he had. The headline, it made me chuckle because it was like patience and perseverance now paying off for the Texans, and I'm like, like they just were kind of like doing nothing, is there other than signing a whole bunch of veteran minimum free agents and spinning their wheels for the last 2 seasons. So maybe in some ways they didn't mortgage themselves in some other way, but man, that trade up is just so painful. Potentially giving up a top 5 pick in the next draft. I don't know. Like, it just literally nothing I can point to that they're doing that I'm really satisfied with, other than they did draft Stroud rather than passing on quarterback. But at the same time, it seems like they had so much internal dissension about that they made a catastrophically bad trade up in order to do something good. So for them, like, it's almost an incomplete sort of grade because I don't necessarily know enough about them, but I'm just willing to throw them in at 4th worst now, even though I don't have a ton of stuff to say, because they didn't do anything for multiple seasons. They just sat there for multiple seasons, and now they're doing something, but in a poor way this season.
I put them as my worst.
Okay, all right. You throw them right under the bus. Okay, I like that. So do you have anything to add to my general pessimism? Because I agree that it's just bad, but you know what? I guess I just had a longer track record of some others that I could really point to.
Yeah, I think that's probably fair, but just like the whole process of this past draft, coupled with not really like last offseason, fine. maybe they were planning on being bad and getting a high pick and picking a quarterback, which is what ended up happening. But the whole, like, everything about the behind the scenes and the decision to trade up and, oh, we were trading up for a quarterback actually, and like all this stuff is just like, it sounds like it's just a complete mess. So if I were a Texan fan, I would have no faith in them to make good decisions going forward.
Yeah. I tried that ESPN article. It was like patience and perseverance. Like he took a nap for 2 years. Okay. So that's spoiler alert there, but we have the rest of yours coming up here. Okay. So why don't you give me then your third? I guess we're on third worst, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So I think this is a repeat from last year, but I have the New York Jets, and we covered a lot of this last year, but they've made some very questionable trade up decisions in the draft. So they traded up for Breece Hall. I think they traded up for ABT, the guard with the Vikings, and I think the Hall one wasn't egregious in terms of what they gave up, but the Vikings one was, and that's one where like you're very overconfident in a prospect, and it's a low value position, and the Vikings ended up with a better player at a higher value position and are paying him less because he was selected later. So it's just an illustration of the pitfalls of trading up at overconfidence. You've talked a lot about the Aaron Rodgers contract and what they gave up to get him. I think it's possible that with Aaron Rodgers, or maybe even probable that with Aaron Rodgers, they're going to have a much better offense than last year. But I think they're probably thinking our defense was great last year. That's going to continue, and we're going to add Aaron Rodgers and be a great team. And I think that's not necessarily going to be the case. And they gave up a lot of draft compensation to pay Aaron Rodgers a lot of money. And aside from Tom Brady, we haven't seen a lot of quarterbacks be super effective at the age that Rodgers has been.
Yeah. So the Jets, I have to say, last year, I'm going to give myself a lashing for not having the Jets in my top 5. I don't know how that happened. So that's my bad on that sort of situation. Yeah, I think it's one of those situations where I thought about making the Jets the worst. Okay, I thought about making them the worst. I did not. I made them second worst. So a little bit of a spoiler there. But because it hedges on the fact of like I do get some rationale for the Rodgers deal, right?
Yep.
Like they're the most improved team by my improvement index. They're gonna be a lot better this year. They're legitimately a top, I don't know, 6 or 7 team in the NFL in terms of Super Bowl odds, and then for the fact they're in the AFC, maybe they're even a bit higher when it comes to like their team strength sort of situation. Yep. But like, I just don't know how much credit I can give them for the fact that no one else wanted Rodgers on this deal. They're bidding against no one. Yep. I thought it was an interesting reveal in an article that I read about the Favre trade in the past. And remember, Favre was second in MVP voting the year before he left to go to the Jets. And the Jets gave up a conditional pick that could go all the way to a first-round pick, but I think they had to go to the Super Bowl for it to be a first-round pick. And they ended up what they ended up getting out of the pick was a 4th that moved to a 3rd. Yep. For Brett Favre at about the same exact age, coming off of being second in MVP voting. The Jets this year, they're just throwing picks all over the place for Rodgers on what has to be a worse contract. I mean, I know that the cap hits aren't high in the next 2 years, but like you can restructure any contract. You can take any contract where you have a $60 million 1-year contract or $110 million over 2 years and restructure it, add void years, and kick the can down the road. This is not brilliance on their part. It's just hard to see how you're getting a ton of value out of Rodgers on the contract alone. And then we just have, first round pick next year, almost a certainty. Pick swap this year, second round pick this year, just pick after pick after pick as part of this deal. It just seems bad. Trading away Elijah Moore for nothing in order to bring in these guys. I don't get that. And then even if we're going to look at the things you're going to give them credit for, like Sauce Gardner last year, I mean, this was a situation for a lot of different draft picks. The Texans picked right before them. The Texans drafted a cornerback. The Texans took Stingley, who was probably seen as being a better player than Gardner. What if the Texans took Gardner?
Yep.
Like, how much credit does Joe Douglas get for nailing this pick? Instead, there's a flip situation. Garrett Wilson last year, that's fine. London went before that. Chris Olave went immediately after that. I think they would have been roughly fine with those picks versus Wilson. It's not like some brilliance, I don't think, in his picking. And before that, it's just like absolute disasters when it comes to Wilson. It comes to Moore, who they've just gotten rid of. It comes to Mekhi Becton, who's done nothing. It comes to Denzel Mims, who's essentially done nothing. And then maybe a hit on Elijah Vera Tucker. But like you said, it was an egregious trade up for a guard. So I don't know. There's a ton of bad here. And I think what it displays more than anything is that a few picks hit, you get the ability to have a good quarterback, and it can just make up for all of these different mistakes. And that's the situation you find the Jets in this year. And their fans will all yell at us if they happen to do well, which I think is very, very possible this year. But I really can't point to anything that they're doing and say it's much of a positive. And that's why I genuinely consider them for the worst team.
Yep, we're in agreement there.
Okay, so who did you have? Did you say your second worst already?
I have not said my second. So
okay.
This is another repeat team from last year, but this is the Saints.
The Saints. Okay. I thought about flipping them and moving the Jets to worst. Okay. So go ahead.
Do you have the Saints in your top 5?
Yeah, I have them as the worst still.
Oh, okay.
Actually, yeah. You know what? I had them as second worst last year. I thought I had them as the worst. I had the Jags as the worst. I don't know what the hell I was doing. Okay. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, we sort of covered this when we talked about the Eagles and taking picks from the Saints, but the Saints have been the most visible example of this overconfidence in the draft that we talked about, where they just repeatedly trade up for guys that they think are going to be it. And sometimes they've hit. Like Chris Olave has been was a very good player in his first season, and he's probably going to be a hit. But for every Chris Olave, there's a Marcus Davenport and these other guys that haven't panned out, and they don't value draft picks. They spent a lot of years kind of kicking the can down the road, like we talked about. And then there's this Derek Carr signing, which I don't know if I don't hate it, but it seems like they're committing to trying to be competitive in a very bad division. And there's no, at least from the outside, there's no vision of how is this team going to put together a team that is going to compete even in the NFC.
Yeah. I think the rationale for me keeping them at worst is I don't hate the Derek Carr signing. It just really, we have everything from before, as you mentioned.
Yep.
It just really typifies this. I talked about the principal agent problem in a recent post. This seems to be almost a perfection of that, although I'm not sure ownership is like actually smart. Or fans are actually smart as being the principal in this discussion. But like, what is this accomplishing for you, this Derek Carr? Like, you're kind of bidding against no one for Derek Carr. I mean, maybe you could say you're bidding against the Jets. Now, remember, he had a discussion with the Panthers, and then the Panthers were like, we're going up to number 1. We're not signing Derek Carr. So you didn't give him a ton of money. It was maybe less money than some people thought. You didn't trade for him, although that might have been, it reminds me, I look back at a thread of some people talking about Derek Carr. Actually, I think you were a part of it because it was with Mina Kimes and some other people where you were like, wait a second, like someone's going to trade for Derek Carr. And the other people were like, yeah, I think he's worth maybe a couple of seconds. And I was like, what? Like Derek Carr on that contract was worth nothing, right? And so the Saints were smart there. But at the same time, you're making him a decently paid quarterback to maybe get you to the playoffs. It's about a coin flip, worse than a coin flip to get into the playoffs, to almost certainly get eliminated. I mean, I know anything can happen in the playoffs. I know a bunch of players can hit for them, but almost certainly if they make the playoffs, get eliminated in the wild card or divisional round. I mean, it's the NFC, so there is a sliver of a chance that they move up, but this essentially gives them no chance, I think, after hitting on Olave and others, of saying maybe we can really hit on quarterback, maybe we can really clean things up and be in strong contention as a perennial Super Bowl contender in a couple of years from now. I just don't see it. So they're really just locked themselves into this quarterback purgatory for the foreseeable future. Also, they can get to the playoffs and probably have a quick exit.
Yep.
Okay, now the one team I realized I did not mention one team, so we have one more fan base to annoy here that I did not mention as my third worst, and I feel like I just had to put them in here, even though I'm not sure if I agree with this or not. But I put the Falcons as being the third worst here.
Okay. Yep.
Now, in a vacuum, I'm not that against the Kyle Pitts pick, although tight end that early is a little bit of a stretch. In a vacuum, maybe I'm not that against some of the free agent signings, but a massive signing of a safety in free agency, spending a bunch. I know people are very excited about this Falcons rebuilt defense, and maybe they'll thread the needle like the Bills did, where they just hit on all these free agency plays. But we've generally seen that does not work. But when you combine the fact that Jamar Chase was available right after Kyle Pitts, and that was just an easy way to go if you didn't want to go quarterback there. When you combine the fact that they drafted London, who I think is fine, but they're not even using them in this offensive system and how they played last year. And then they come back with Bijan Robinson here as a top pick, even though they got great play out of Tyler Algier and Cordell Patterson and, Caleb Huntley, whoever they gave the ball to. They played well last year. And they just had a ton of money where they just dug themselves out of a couple of years of being able to do nothing because they were in cap hell for a while. They dug themselves out of that, immediately spent a ton because they're in this third year of a window where they need to be good. And then, now they're just a huge risk at quarterback. All of this is being done. And you're just saying it's going to be Desmond Ridder, or maybe you're going to bring in Taylor Heineke to come in eventually if Ridder doesn't pan out. I don't know, man. Like, it just seems massively wrong to me. And they should have been strongly in that bidding to get up to number 3 to potentially draft Anthony Richardson. I have no idea why they weren't part of that, why they weren't part of the Lamar Jackson discussion, all of those sorts of things. It just seems like a massive waste of a rebuild, potentially. I mean, if Ridder hits, then all bets are off, but we just have to go on base rates and assume that's not going to happen.
Yeah, it feels a little bit like the Seahawks last year, where they're like, we have Drew Lock and Geno Smith, and here we go. And the Seahawks, it actually worked out, and so maybe it will for the.
Yeah, that was a quarterback competition. People got to remember that was like Drew Lock may have actually been in the lead in the quarterback competition, if not for I think he got COVID or something, and then couldn't start during the preseason.
Third preseason game. The Falcons' offense was pretty good last year, even when Mariota was playing. So maybe they have the infrastructure with their offensive line and Arthur Smith calling plays and the schedule they're going to face, that like maybe if Ridder is just average or close to it, they could have a really good offense and not look embarrassed for not having pursued a quarterback over the offseason.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a chance that they could be good. And you mentioned this whole thing. It amazes me sometimes with the Ridder discussion where you say he's a 3rd-round pick, probably won't be good. Like, that's just the facts.
Yep.
Or you talk about these different players and whether or not London or Pitts will take it. There's like, well, they don't have Mariota throwing them with the ball anymore. I mean, Mariota averaged like 7.4 yards per attempt versus Ridder at 6.1 or 6.2. Like, I guess maybe optically it looked really, really bad for Mariota, but the results actually were not that bad for him. He just never threw the ball. I mean, but at the same time, Ridder averaged like 160 yards passing a game in his 4 starts.
Yeah, it is one of those things where Mariota missed some throws so badly that, especially down the field, where people were like, okay, this guy cannot play quarterback. So anything relative to that is going to be seen as an improvement, even if the actual offense didn't get better when.
I mean, he threw away a couple of games that they were in position to win. So maybe it was like the flip side of a quarterback being bad and then getting a 4th quarter comeback, and we give him credit for it. Yeah. Where it was the flip side, where he played well and then completely messed up the game at the end, and everyone remembered that.
There are also a lot of people with very strong Desmond Ridder takes based on college film, which I think is probably not warranted given that he lasted to the 3rd round in the draft, and there were a lot of teams that needed quarterbacks, but that priors is what people have.
I mean, he could be good. It's not saying there's no chance. Like,
Yeah.
whatever. There's a 10% chance, 15% chance. Maybe he ends up being a pretty good quarterback. So, get your 10-sided die out and roll it. And every now and again, you're gonna hit. And they'll have a great they'll have a great time going forward. I guess I just don't quite see what they're doing here, other than maybe competing in a poor division. All right. Any other thoughts on overrated, underrated, particular front office? I'm trying to think of here at the top. Any ones we didn't touch on?
So
I guess Kansas City Chiefs. Do you have any thoughts on Kansas City Chiefs, since they're pretty much going to be like in the top 3 on everyone's list, and we did not talk about them in either direction?
yeah, the Chiefs and the Bengals are the two front offices that, like, obviously they're very successful teams and have been over the last couple of years. So people are going to put them near the top of the list. I think for the Bengals, I think it's pretty easy to make the argument against them having some sort of special sauce where, okay, they got the number 1 pick and took the obvious number 1 quarterback prospect, and then he got hurt and they took his wide receiver teammate who was a very, very good prospect. The T. Higgins pick was good, but like, it's a lot of how good
even on the Chase pick, right? Like, if the Falcons were not idiots and they took Chase, then where are they, right? Yeah.
Then they've had a good team in part on the basis of those 3 players. Plus, they have made some good signings on defense and have at least hit on those. It's hard to know, again, whether that's just getting lucky.
I think the Bengals have been okay. Recently, they weren't like recently. I feel like they've been almost in that not do anything egregiously bad category, which can put them in like the second tier of front offices.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then for the Chiefs, I guess they've changed. So if you had asked me a few years ago, right after the CEH pick, they'd be like, okay, and the Frank Clark trade, like, both of those were just egregiously bad moves, I think.
CEH, in fact, did not gain 7 yards on first down, average 7 yards on first down, which he was supposed to do according to the theory of that pick.
Yeah, so they spent a first on CEH. They traded a fortune to extend Frank Clark at a very high rate, and Chiefs fans will say, "Oh, he's the playoff leader in sacks or whatever," and he won us our first.
Do they say that? Oh my God, these are growing cheese. Okay, I didn't realize that.
Oh yeah, playoff Frank Clark is a thing where he's.
Are we going per game? They played a lot of games.
No, he's up there. If you look at all-time postseason sack leaders, he's either first or second, I think.
Okay.
But yeah, these were all a few years ago, and I think more recently they've been more reasonable. So the Tyreek Hill trade, I think, made sense at the time, and our friend Eric Eager did a good job of explaining why they did it and why it made sense at the time, and all of that aged extremely well. In part because their offense was still great due to having Patrick Mahomes and Kelsey and Andy Reid still, and also they won the Super Bowl, so they showed they didn't have to go all in. They have Patrick Mahomes. They're going to make a bet on being in the mix every season for a long time and hope that they get lucky in some years. And last year it happened. So I could, if they keep running their team like they have in the last year or two, I could probably be talked into moving them, maybe even into the top 5. Maybe I have more faith in them than the Rams right now. And I think, at least for me, the case is easier for putting the Chiefs high than it is for the Bengals of those two.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I mean, I thought what they did with the Tyreek Hill, like letting him go as part of that trade. It wasn't one of those. It was kind of like the Russell Wilson trade in my mind, where it wasn't necessarily great for what they were going to do with their on-field performance, but you couldn't really argue with the return that they got on that and the contract that he signed, and being willing to say, okay, let's piece it together. Let's get MVS and let's get Juju Smith-Schuster. Let's do that sort of stuff. Let's let Trevarius Ward leave for a huge contract. Let's not, continue to double down on some of this stuff and really take a step back as far as what their spending was last season, not restructure Mahomes' contract. I think all that stuff was pretty good. And I'll give them credit for it. And they're, kind of continuing to move in that direction this year. We'll see if Kelsey doesn't stay healthy. Like, We could be this whole thing could have been rewritten completely differently if it wasn't for outstanding health and outstanding lack of age decline for Kelsey, which you really is an outlier, a total outlier because he's old. I mean, he's almost the same age as Rob Gronkowski.
Yep.
Okay, he's within a year of Rob Gronkowski, and he's still playing like potentially, an elite player until this age. So that's the one thing where I felt like it was a little bit that they set up a very fragile roster last year, and it worked, and it clicked, and it happened. This year, it may not happen. So I do think a year from now, we might be speaking a little bit differently about the Chiefs. Well, we probably will be anyway, because they're probably not going to win the Super Bowl again, although they have a great chance of doing it. So I guess I'm just not quite ready to put them in there, but I agree with you that I think because of what they did last year and not doing an all-in sort of Billsian sort of thing like the Bills did this year again, which they had done in the past, they worked their way out of that with some luck and some good decisions that I'll put them in the second tier of front offices. All right. Anything else you want to talk about, Ben, here? You want to get off your chest? Hot takes you got for us this off season, or anything else you're working on with the NFL verse and everything on there?
Not really. Just making sure everything works. The most recent.
I greatly appreciate it. I got to make a donation. Draw me the link to donate to you guys.
The most recent useful thing that I know that you have used is the player participation data, so you can actually know which players are on the field at a given time, which is useful for a lot of different things. So if you're interested in that, then please check it out.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just having a discussion with Brandon Thorne, DM, the other day, where he was asking about some on-off stuff for offensive linemen. So I was like, well, yeah, it can be done. I don't know. I don't know if you're just going to get in there and like figure it out. Like there's not a web app set up for that yet, but it's interesting. And the most important thing, of course, about that is we can build extremely misleading on-off splits to either downgrade or upgrade players. I think that's the most important thing you can do.
I do think someone made a shiny app with the on-off stuff. I'll try to dig it up.
Excellent. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, maybe I'll if you have that, send it to me and then I'll send it over to Brandon. Anyway, Ben, thanks so much for doing this. I know when I talked to Cade Massey over at Wharton Moneyball, the Warren professor, he said that he had listened to this last year. He said he thought that I was like rigidly ideological in my evaluations. Do you think I'm rigidly ideological? Actually,
well, you and I have pretty similar views and rankings. So if you are, then I am too.
He thought that I went too far, and I was like, interesting. I didn't think I actually was that ideological. But maybe
that was about the Jaguars being the worst.
Yeah, maybe. I think he's done some consulting for the Ravens. So we had the Ravens at number 1, Kate, last year. Sorry, downgrade this year. But anyway, thanks so much for doing this, making the time. Your opinion is always like top of the list for me whenever I'm doing this type of exercise. So thanks so much for joining me, man.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.